大家好，欢迎收看今天的明镜连线。自委内瑞拉反对派领袖瓜伊多自行宣布为临时总统，国际社会因为两位总统形成旗帜分明的站队。中国和俄罗斯作为委内瑞拉长期的盟友，对外表态一直是支持马杜罗，但是这周似乎出现了转机。据《华尔街日报》12日称，中方外交人士在最近几周内与瓜伊多代表进行了谈判。这是否意味着中方的立场开始松动呢？早些时候，美国对委内瑞拉国有石油企业进行了制裁。有观察者提出，这个时间点有点耐人寻味，恰好发生在中美贸易谈判进程之中。《纽约时报》更有一篇评论指出，美国很有可能是利用委内瑞拉来驱逐中国和俄罗斯在拉丁美洲的强势。明镜电视评论员何频在上周的一期《点点今天事》中也提到过，对美国来说，拉丁美洲更像是一个志在必得的后院，委内瑞拉是美国能够找到支点的一个最好机会。今天我们请到了来自威尔逊国际学者中心的专家 Benjamin 田雅明，他目前专门研究的项目是拉丁美洲在中美之间的角色。So, Benjamin Creutzfeldt is a fellow at Wilson Center. His current project focuses on Latin America between China and the United States. Hi, Benjamin, how are you?
Hello, 大家好，谢谢你们的邀请。
So, Benjamin has a Chinese name that's called 田雅明. Could you tell a little bit about that?
That was given to me by some Chinese friends a good 30 years ago, a colleague of my father's from Shanghai.
Cool. But our conversation still would be in English.
I prefer that, yes, for this time.
So
it's a complex issue. Venezuela and China relations is complicated.
Okay, so let's start. There is a Wall Street Journal story that happened yesterday that says representatives from both Beijing and then representatives from the Venezuela's opposition leader Guaido have met to talk about certain issues. This seems like such a big shift because China has always been Maduro's ally. So I wonder, what are we interpreting from this act? Do you see like there is a worry arising from Beijing that Maduro would not be able to pay back the debt?
There's a number of things to unpack there. Firstly, of course, Beijing has for many years, even decades, had a policy of engaging, of sitting down, of being open to conversations with parties, different parties in all countries, and has recently, about 3 years ago, organized events for parties from all over the world to gather and talk, meaning breaking away from just conversations with heads of state. So China has actually got a long-standing policy and interest. They've done this in other countries as well, in Panama, in El Salvador, in Colombia, and also in Venezuela. And in fact, there were reports, though it's hard to confirm these, that the Beijing government, the representatives were speaking unofficially with opposition leaders in Venezuela in 2016, over 2 years ago. So it's not a complete break. It's just more significant now. And the other thing you mentioned is, of course, ally. You know, China as a policy doesn't have technically allies, and especially has always kept a certain arm's length politically to the Venezuelan government. So it's one needs to look at that with good care and be careful not to overinterpret. Certainly there is a worry that given that over 40 countries have now recognized Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela, Beijing is understandably somewhat put into a difficult position of having to, if not choose sides, at least be open to both sides. It's not so much whether Maduro can pay anything back, it's whether a new government, whether an interim government under Guaido until new elections are held, or indeed a newly elected government, which might be neither Maduro nor Guaido, would honor the obligations and continue projects that China has been developing for almost 20 years with the Venezuelan government.
It looks like Guaido has also shown hospitality to Beijing recently, but it looks like either way, China would still have a pretty close relationship with Venezuela. So do you think if eventually Guaido comes to power, it would make any difference to the China-Venezuela relationship?
That depends a little on how independent Guaido can be in the interests of his people, how much influence he has. The slightly worrying sign I found was that Guaido made an opening in an interview with South China Morning Post about 10 days ago, in which he implicitly sort of suggested that China would be an important friend of Venezuela going forward, also under his guidance, under his leadership. That was sort of unconditional, it seemed. Then Vecchio, Guaido's designated ambassador to Washington, D.C., who obviously is a bit closer to what's going on here in D.C., and also it must be very difficult to coordinate such an incipient government interim government in Venezuela, given the situation. It's not so clear as it sounds. There was a different sound from what Vecchio said, which was that Venezuela would honor its debts to its obligations to China, as long as they had been ratified by the National Assembly, by Parliament. And this is something that I think would make Beijing quite nervous, because there are certainly many deals that were done state to state, head to head, and didn't go through the due processes that they should have. And therefore, that's where I think Beijing has reason to be a bit concerned. At the same time, you know well that China has been investing in almost all countries in Latin America, and in fact the world, has loan agreements, has infrastructure projects, and some of the Venezuelan projects were in fact joint investments by PDVSA, the oil company, the state-owned oil company, and China's Development Bank and other institutions. So it's not as though I think it's so easy, or even in Venezuela's interest, in any future leadership to change that situation. It may just be put into question. Some contracts may be adjusted. This is, I think, why it's very wise for some openness from Beijing to enter into conversation with Guaido as an interim leader.
Right. Before we dive deeper into China's investment and infrastructure building actions in Latin America, could you go back a little bit and walk us through the history between China and Venezuela? For example, why does China and Venezuela have such a close relationship dating back years before?
That's a good question. And the answer depends on who you listen to, who you read. There are some analysts who have stated very persuasively that it's because Hugo Chavez, the leader since the late 90s until he died in 2013, saw China as a model of socialist success and wanted to create his own revolution in that sense. And so he would even carry Chairman Mao's Red Book and quote and reach out to the brethren of the socialist movement, and this was something that at the time Hu Jintao was very reluctant to. He didn't embrace in that way. So you can see that both Chavez like to emphasize the idea of a common ideology with China, which the Chinese were very polite about and sort of didn't negate, but also didn't embrace. And secondly, it's something that in Washington was always part of the story. It was always emphasized that China has been heavily supporting governments in Bolivia, Ecuador, but sometimes Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, that were what you would call, left-leaning, had ideas for of supporting more the masses and reducing the power of the elites in their own countries, which these are very strong. These were strong movements, but unfortunately, what really went on underneath what was China's interest was not to promote any particular ideology. It was quite clear all along that what Beijing was looking for specifically was an access to Venezuela's oil, because it is known now to be the country with the single largest oil reserves. Right. And that is, even though it is necessary for humanity to wean itself off oil, on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't look like anybody is seriously trying, not even China. Although it's moving towards electric cars, it still depends heavily on oil imports, and Venezuela is that ideal target, as is the United States. It also has greater independence. It produces more oil itself in this country, but also needs to import, or has traditionally imported, a lot of oil from Venezuela. So you see that there is this economic issue, the energy security that China seeks, has sought for many years, that have driven its interest and its commitment to Venezuela, and it will continue this kind of priority. Whereas the ideological aspect really is something that has been discussed a lot, but emphasized a lot, but doesn't really pan out. And now, sadly, it's become more and more clear over the last few years that Maduro has led the Venezuelan economy into a very, very, very deep pit. And that is something that many people are suffering from this. And so there is now, perhaps, even though Beijing refuses to intervene in internal affairs of other countries, there is some sense of a moral obligation to change this dynamic.
Right. Talking about Venezuela oil and this sense of responsibility to build Venezuela, I am aware of comments accusing Beijing of only relying on this debt-based relationship with Venezuela and not putting into any resources in building a sustainable development model in Venezuela. I wonder if you're aware of accusations like that, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are all sorts of accusations left and right. I can understand that, first of all, there are people on the internet inside China who are not so happy that large amounts of money are being loaned, being invested, public funds, state money from China goes into any country, especially one that is so badly managed as Venezuela. So that's certainly some negative pushback from inside China, and that's quite important, I think, for the leaders in Zhongnanhai. They listen to that kind of criticism and worry about that a bit. And then in terms of what has been developed, really, I mean, I haven't been there myself. To Venezuela, and I'm guilty of. Nowadays, it is more difficult, also for my colleagues, to travel there. It is, however, clear from what China has been doing in many other parts of the world, and including across Latin America, that it is sending. And I've spoken to Chinese entrepreneurs who have been in Venezuela for many years. They themselves can report that there were projects started to build railroads, to expand ports, to make it possible to connect cities and the seaside, and so on. So there have been some very real efforts, but sadly the control during that bonanza of money coming in, especially when the oil prices were very high, led many people to basically abuse of their position and steal untold amounts of money. That there are many reports, and this is really the tragedy of it, that what was a very, I would even say, noble idea and well proposed by Hugo Chavez to change the fabric of society in Venezuela was heavily damaged by the selfish interest of quite a number of people, both in the government and in the military, which has gained a very strong position inside Venezuela.
The last thing I want to talk about would be the relationship between US, China, and Venezuela, or maybe broadly Latin America, because you are an expert on this relationship. And so it's interesting how this crisis in Venezuela happened in a time when the US-China trade talk is taking place. So there are comments that US is putting these sanctions on Venezuela as a way of putting stress on China. And I'm not sure if you've read about this, but you've tweeted out a New York Times op-ed that it's about, the title is "A Geopolitical Showdown in Venezuela Will Only Make Things Worse," which writes about how US is using Venezuela as an entry point to try to oust China and Russia impact in Latin America. So I wonder what would be your thoughts on this relationship.
It's clearly, I mean, in Washington, I wouldn't say in the United States overall, but in Washington, China is the favorite enemy number one on all fronts. And since there is a bilateral dependency that is very deep, even, maybe highlighted by the US trade war going on around us, it is really in third countries, in other regions, in Europe, where the US is trying to push its allies to resist Chinese corporate advances, especially Huawei, in Latin America, where United States observers have long been nervous, and also military commands have been nervous about China's and Russia's advances there. Africa, which has also been brought up as somewhere where basically the United States is trying all over to, I wouldn't say contain as such, but to basically reduce Chinese influence where they can. It's often mixed up. This Chinese-Russian thing is just a simplification. Of course, the strategies and abilities and influence of Russia and China are completely different, a different set of different strategies, and but still, there they are bunched together. And so, in that sense, it is probably true that people in Washington, a number of strategists, feel that this is an opportunity to basically reduce a foothold that China has gained in the region. But that is very ill-advised, in my view, and I think many more sort of clear-headed thinkers would agree that it is collaboration that one would seek. And I wonder what Beijing will now do. If they're talking to the opposition, as is reported, then it would be a very clever move, an interesting chess move or weiqi move to suddenly basically switch and to be more strongly on the side of this interim leadership and see how that develops. And it would shift the tables and shift the weighting and be something that suddenly China would be on the side of the US in this. I wouldn't be surprised if this enters into conversations, at least on the sidelines of the current US-China trade negotiations, because it's all part of a big pattern. That is certainly true, that the US is nervous about losing influence all over, and here in Venezuela they have an opportunity to insert themselves forcefully, hopefully not militarily, but just having basically hopefully achieve a new leadership that is closer to Washington. But if China can manage that, go along with that transition smoothly, they will not lose, and nor does there can be room for new forms of trilateral cooperation. After all, Venezuela has all that oil, and both the US and China need it. So there are many scenarios that are imaginable.
It looks like the crisis in Venezuela would likely still go on for a bit longer. So my last question would be, what do you anticipate would be these two leaders, Maduro and Guaido's next moves?
I hesitate to predict anything. It's too difficult for me, and I think for most to really know well.
Right.
A big poker hand is held by a strong poker hand is held by the military, and so in Venezuela. And so if there is any indication of where this is going, it would be by understanding in detail which sections of the military in Venezuela are shifting their allegiances. Also, Colombian President Duque will be visiting Washington tomorrow and actually speaking here at the Wilson Center. So that's also a very important moment, because clearly Colombia has been the recipient of has suffered the biggest immigration from Venezuela. So they've borne the brunt of this, the immigration of desperate Venezuelans. And this is quite destabilizing in the border area, but also across the country, and a big worry. Secondly, then John Bolton, the Trump administration, was shown to be presenting the possibility of stationing a large number of American troops in Colombia, obviously also meant to either stem the outflow of Venezuelans or support any violent change inside the country, inside Venezuela. So all these scenarios are concerning, and tomorrow will shed some light on where this is going. I'm sure that there will be some conversation, basically the meeting Duque-Trump, if it happens tomorrow or Friday, will be a lot about Venezuela.
Okay, thank you so much, Benjamin.
Thank you, 非常感谢，很乐意参加。
关于委内瑞拉的动态，我们明镜电视会持续跟踪报道。以上就是本期的明镜连线，感谢大家收看，我们下期再见。